Hello everyone, this is Alex your Chess here to help you to realize your potential. And today I'm very excited to be bringing to you my first Smith-Morra tutorial. Some of you have been requesting this in the comment section. You've been requesting it for white and for black. But today I'm going to be bringing you what I think to be one of black's best defenses, at least at the moment as it stands from my Smith-Morra knowledge. And it's going to be the pin variation of the Smith-Morra, which, as we can see here, has been played against the Great Marc Esserman 380 times in the database and scores well with 38%. So if it works against Esserman, I know that it's going to work against your opponents, since Marc Esserman is 27 to 2800, sometimes as high as 3000, and is playing against the best players in the world, much better than the players that I'm playing against even. And so I know that it's going to help you guys to get a lot of nice victories when you face this opening. So here we're going to be looking at the game against Vice Rocket that he played. We're going to be looking at the game against AP 2804, and we're going to be looking at a game against the Operator. And we're not going to be looking at these games in full. We're just going to be looking at the game up to the critical point and the analysis that I'm going to be giving, which you guys can have a look at, and you can see in the research study that I've created, and you can check out the games for yourselves in full. But I'm going to be covering the key variations that show that black can indeed defend himself against this opening. So let's get started. After e4, c5, d4, we have our Smith-Morra, takes c3, and here black can play knight to f6, going back into the Alapin. You can also play d5, which transposes into Caro-Kann Panov-Botvinnik attack, and you can play d3 as well, which goes into the Maroczy bind. But here we have pawn takes pawn, the Smith-Morra accepted, knight takes, e6, knight to f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, and bishop to b4, the start of the pin variation. And here after castles, knight g7, queen to c2, we have castles, and after rook to d1, queen a5, getting off of the d file. Now we have a3, excuse me, and we're going to be coming back to this position to have a look at what happens after bishop to d2. But after a3, bishop takes knight is pretty much forced. And now after pawn takes, in order to keep queens on the board, we have d5. Now we could play b6 here. And after bishop to e2, d5, white could try c4 here, but black is not going to take on c4 and liquidate white's weakness. Instead, you can take on e4, and after queen takes e4, black has queen to f5, and if something like bishop to d3, takes, bishop to b7, black is totally fine. For example, if a4, knight to a5, setting a nice trap, we have bishop takes, knight takes, and if rook d7 going for the win of a piece, we have rook f to d8, and if you take either of these knights, you get back rank mated in 2, with rook d1, knight e1, and rook takes knight mate. Therefore, you have to swap, and here, with only 6 pieces on the board, and white having 2 weaknesses, and being down a pawn, especially this big weakness on c4, that can be ganged up on by both of these knights and this rook. Black has a winning endgame here, as you can see. So if we go back to the game continuation after pawn takes, we also have the immediate d5, which was played in the game. And after bishop to d3, pawn takes, bishop takes, h6, preventing knight g5 and saving our 8th pawn from bishop takes h7 check. c4, opening up the dark squared bishop along the long diagonal. e5, closing down that long diagonal and opening up the black light squared bishop so that it and the queen's rook can get into play. After bishop to b2, bishop to g4, pinning this knight on f3 to the rook on d1, h3, and here in the game, bishop to h5 was played, which is also fine for black, but we can play the much more forcing. Instead of bishop to h5, bishop takes f3, which I've given an X-clam here. Now we're going to give up the two bishops, but not only do we have the knights here versus the bishops, we have an extra pawn. White has a weakness on c4, and because of these imbalances, black is able to hold here. For example, if rook a d8, pawn to c5, increasing the scope of the queen, and also threatening to double up, trouble up on the d file with rook to d6 in some cases. We can drop our queen back to c7 to cover, and after queen a4, rook takes, rook takes, rook d8, here black is fine. For example, if g3 here, we have rook takes, and after queen takes, king to f8, queen to d3, f6, building a pawn chain here to block out this bishop. And if queen to h7, we simply don't care after queen to d7, because if queen to h8 check, knight g8, bishop to e2 to reroute and attack the g8 square and the g8 knight simply doesn't work. After queen to d2, bishop c4, knight c to e7, and here white can't save the dark squared bishop. And if bishop to a1, we even have queen to c1 here, which attacks and wins the light squared bishop because the dark squared bishop is not going anywhere. And in the event of bishop takes on g8, we have knight takes and the dark squared bishop is not going anywhere. So here, white is going to lose this piece and the game. We also have after g3, if you don't want to play into rook takes d1, because obviously white getting his queen semi-trapped over here on h8 is nowhere near forced. If you don't want to play it this way, you could play 21 rook to d7, and if rook to e1, trying to keep pieces on the board, we have king to f8 here as well as interesting, as well as f6, although I would not go for f6 myself here. I think that it's slightly premature, as you do not want to weaken the light squares if you don't have to. So king to f8 also centralizes the king and keeps everything covered. It gets off of f7 being any sort of a pin later on, and I think this endgame here is perfectly fine for black. Now, if we go back to bishop to d2, again, we're not going to be looking at the gains in full because you could do that on your own. We're just sticking to the opening for our tutorial purposes. After bishop to d2 here, we have d5, and after bishop to d3 takes. If white were to play knight takes, which was not played in the game against AP 2804, we have bishop takes, knight e takes d2, queen h5, covering h7, and now if bishop to e4, knight d5, centralizing, knight to c4, knight c e7, and knight c e7 solidifies the d5 square. After rook to d4, b6, rook a d1. Here black has a choice. If you play knight to c6, there is rook 4 to d2, knight c e7, and if rook d4, knight c6, you have a threefold repetition coming. If bishop to b7 instead, then there is knight d6, and after bishop to a6, white cannot play queen to a4 due to bishop e2, swapping out the dangerous king's knight. And if bishop to a6, we have, well actually before bishop to a6, hold on, instead of queen to a4, there's rook to a4, excuse me, rook a d8, and after knight takes f7, Here, king takes is perfectly fine according to the engine, which is also why I would not want to play this variation here as black, because here after bishop to b7, which is dubious, knight to d6, bishop a6, we could wind up running into that shot after rook to a4, that knight takes f7 shot after rook a d8, and knight takes f7 didn't even come up by the engine straight away, but here after it's on the board, now we can see that king takes is better, even though it was just suggesting if knight takes f7, black has rook to c8. So the engine is a little bit schizo here. So here, instead of bishop to b7, we have knight to c6 as mentioned, which is perfectly fine. And we also have bishop to a6 immediately. And if knight ce5 now, rook a c8 attacking the white queen. And after queen a4, bishop to e2, here black is again fine. And if rook to e1, bishop takes, and here white should play bishop takes instead of knight takes, because after bishop takes, black has to move the queen again, so queen to f5, and here we could have another potential draw by repetition, as well as we have queen to g5 if you would like to keep the game going, but queen h5, bishop f3 could also lead to a draw. Now on move 13, instead of after knight e takes d2, queen h5, we also have knight g6 according to the engine, but I don't really trust this variation, because after bishop takes knight, h takes, bishop c4, queen h5, queen c3, we can see here that the engine suggests f6 for us, and after white plays knight d6, I feel like black is on the verge of potentially getting choked out here, because king to h7 just seems very iffy to me. So if you guys would like to play this, you could play this at your own risk, but just know that I would much rather you guys play queen to h5 on move 13, but this is also another option that gives you equality, albeit at some risk, because you have to move all of these pawns, and as we know, we generally don't want to move pawns in front of our king, as it softens up the king position. Now in the game, bishop takes was played instead of knight takes on move 12, and if queen to h5 here, queen b3 attacking the dark squared bishop. Now there's some pressure here, and here black could play bishop c5, which you guys could investigate on your own, but I suggest king to h8 here, because king to h8, if white plays something too slow, like h3, which is still perfectly fine, e5, here white needs knight to d5 or knight b5 or knight e2, rerouting this knight and trying to get black to swap pieces, which is ironic, since typically you don't want to swap in a gambit, but as we can see, if we swap, the rook could come forward potentially. But here, if white plays a wasteful move, like king h2, which I know is bad, but just to illustrate the point, black has moved the king to h8, the pawn is moved up to e5, and now after f5, black is doing amazing here. Because of bishop takes knight, knight takes, and something like knight to d5, we have bishop to d6, which threatens e4, which wins a piece, but also all of our pieces are active. We have our pawn majority of 4 to 3 going, and we have good control over the center squares. So that's why I'm suggesting king to h8 here on move 13. Now here, white can play bishop to f4, which is a great move as it controls the center dark squares on this diagonal as well, the whole diagonal, but mostly e5 and d6. And if black plays f6 here, knight to d4, here we have bishop takes knight as a potential idea, but we also have e5 with a pawn fork, and this is very forcing. So after knight takes, the dark squared bishop is hanging, the knight on e7 is under attack, and we can just play knight takes, and after bishop takes knight, we have bishop takes knight, and after bishop to f3, bishop g4. Here, we can't play bishop takes b7 due to bishop takes rook, hitting the white queen and just cleanly winning the game. And if queen takes b7, here we would run into rook a b8, and after something like queen to d5, a swap out gaining tempo, and after takes, we have moves like queen to g6, and if something like king to h1, we have bishop takes on b2. If bishop to g3, we also have bishop to d4 here, centralizing and keeping pressure. So this is just completely winning for black. Therefore, on move 19, here white needs to play bishop takes, and after queen takes, bishop to e3, putting some pressure on a7, bishop to d4, centralizing and challenging the bishop, and after takes, black is perfectly fine here. And there's more analysis here that continues with several variations, all of which lead to equality for black. It's just different ways that you could do it in this endgame. So black is up a pawn, but you're going to lose the pawn on b7, and then you need to be able to either maintain the central pawn or go after and exchange off white's queenside majority of 2-1. Now, if we go back to move 8, we're going to have a look at what happens after bishop to g5 here. And here, black can castle, and after e5, here we could play the move pawn to h6. And here, if bishop to h4, we can take on c3, and after takes, queen a5, rook to e1, knight f5, which goes after the dark squared bishop, and after bishop to g3, b6, bishop to d3, we have again this maneuver, knight ce7, in order to cover our knight so that our pawn formation does not get split. And after knight to d4, here the computer's top choice is to take the dark squared bishop. However, I myself do not like centralized knights by my opponent, so I would suggest for you guys to take on d4. And after pawn takes, we have bishop to a6, attempting to exchange the right squared bishops. And after bishop to e4, here we have knight to d5 as a possibility. We also have rook ac8. I found rook ac8 to be quite interesting. Knight to d5, yes, is the best move, and I'm going to mark that in the study as a great move here. But there's another idea here that you guys could use, which is after rook ac8, bishop to f4, trying to get this bishop back into play. We have bishop to c4 here, going after the d5 square with our bishop. And here we can see that this is all perfectly fine. And after bishop to b7, there's even a nifty exchange sacrifice here. After bishop to d5, takes, rook takes, a4, because this pawn is being pressurized and this rook needs to get into play at some point. Rook to c4, queen d3, putting some pressure on the rook and the bishop. And after knight to f5, bishop to d2, hitting the queen, queen to a6. Now we have to be careful about our queen. But after a move like a5, we can play b5 here, which just shuts everything down for white. And in the event of bishop to e3, which is the top choice by the engine, we have queen c8. And here after rook ec1, we could play rook to c6. And here the computer likes swapping out, as you can see. But after pawn takes, if we look at the board, we have opposite colored bishops. We have a light squared bishop, which is centralized and very powerful. The d4 pawn is backward and it's not going anywhere anyway due to the mechanical prevention of the bishop on d5 being locked in. Here, black basically has a fortress in my opinion, because it's going to be very hard for white to activate this rook. Now, about the only thing that white could do is attempt to move forward these kingside pawns at some point in order to deal with this knight, but that could very easily backfire in a practical game, especially if we are left with the h4 and or g6 squares, or if white tries to advance and gives us the f5 square back after the g pawn reaches g5 and beyond. So here I would say that this is also a good practical try for black, but of course after bishop to e4 you could just simply play the best move, which is knight to d5, and the game goes on with black being much better here. But these are the variations that I've gone through, that I've cooked up after looking at these 3 games by the Master of Mayhem himself. And also I would like to show you guys one variation that I cooked up based upon my own games, which is after knight to d5. Here you can take, and after takes, knight to a5 hitting the bishop. We have bishop to e2, bishop to d6 from black, and after queen to d4 centralizing, you can castle kingside. And here if b4, knight ac6 gives back the piece successfully. This is also what should have been done in the game against Grandmaster Novik 70. He should have given back the piece instead of keeping all the material to himself. So after takes, bishop to b2, knight f5, jumping the knight into play, attacking the queen, defending g7, queen to g4, and now here after c5, which gets ready to put the knight on the d4 square. Here if pawn takes, bishop takes, queen to e4, rook to e8 from black, queen c2, hitting the bishop. Now we can tuck the bishop with bishop f8, and we don't have to worry about g7 anymore for the time being. And if bishop to d3, g6, white does not have queen to c3 due to bishop g7, which just simply wins a piece after this continuation. And in the event of g6, bishop takes, and now queen c3, we have f6, and here black is fine. We could continue the line for the sake of the argument. Knight d4, bishop to d7, and if something like bishop to a3, we could swap out, and then we could bring our queen to the 6th rank, hitting the knight. And if, say, rook f to d1, rook e4, we could go on the offensive. If something like knight to b3, we could just double up, threatening back rank stuff if rook takes bishop. We could also, after knight to f3, play queen to e6, and now we can shift our queen over to an active position before playing bishop to c6, which covers everything. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I will be updating it when I have the time. And also I would like to see games from you guys, so post your games in the comment section or send them to me on Lichess. Just send me a message, and if you use these variations successfully, I might feature some of the games on the channel for other people to enjoy. Also, I will be playing these variations myself and posting games where I have success against Smith-Morra, which I face very commonly on my Lichess account, but not too often. For example, you guys could see here that if I go to my account, after e4, c5, we'll switch out here from Master of Mayhem to my account. and we're going to look at my gains as black. And here, overwhelmingly, I face the open Sicilian, but in the case of d4 takes, c3 takes, knight takes, here I will be playing the pin variation instead of all the stuff that I was playing before, because now that I've been forced to look at this stuff in more detail, because I need to make a tutorial for you guys, and I need to be able to help all of you to become better players. You're also helping me to become a better player by expanding my own repertoire. So the pin variation is something that I'll be playing instead of a6, which I don't have a bad score with myself, but it'll be a lot more interesting to play the pin variation instead. So thank all of you for watching. Thank you for helping me to realize my potential. And I hope that I'm doing the same for all of you, the viewer. And I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and that it serves you well. Have a great day, and thank you for watching.